Welcome to the Head Shepherd podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ferguson, CEO here at NextGen Agri International, where we help livestock managers get the best out of their stock. Before we get started, thank you to our two fantastic sponsors for continuing to sponsor this podcast. MSD Animal Health is perhaps better known as Cooper's Animal Health in Australia and for their Allflex range across the world, with a comprehensive suite of animal health and management products. Heineken is a one-stop shop for wool harvesting and animal fibre removal. The Heineken team have a deep understanding of livestock agriculture, backed by Swiss engineering and a family business dedicated to manufacturing the best. We are grateful to our sponsors for their support, helping us bring Head Shepherd to you each week. And now it's time to get on with this week's episode. Welcome back to Head Shepherd. This week we've got Angus Gidley-Baird from Rabobank along to talk markets. It was recorded a few weeks ago, prior to Lamax actually. Before we get into that, there's an article we put up on the Hub this week, which was in response to Hamish Thompson, I think, ringing or emailing me about IMF and sort of wanting to understand the biology of it a little bit more, and I've sort of told him snippets over time, and he wanted to clarify that in his head. So I sort of started tapping that out for Hamish, and I thought this would actually make a decent article for everybody. So that's on the Hub this week, kind of talking about the metabolism that goes on behind IMF. I don't pretend to be a meat scientist or a biochemist by any stretch of the imagination, but tried to pull together some of the known literature around sort of why when we selected for growth and muscle, we ended up taking IMF out of animals, and so why some of the high IMF animals sort of lack muscle, but kind of the muscle type differences. So yeah, I enjoyed writing it. Hopefully you enjoy reading it. So that's on the Hub. Get there and have a read, and yeah, by all means ask your questions or pose your comments. That's what the Hub's all about. So we'd love to hear what you think, and you might have had a different experience or something that you can contribute, which would be great. This week, Angus Gidley-Baird is he's an analyst with Rabo based out of Sydney. He basically looks at and talks about the markets. It's sort of like guessing what the future is going to, or predicting the future, I suppose. And we all want these sort of people to tell us rosy things, and largely he does tell us some rosy things around the market. It's recorded a couple of months ago, so some of the all of what he said will still be holding true. But it's, I guess, we don't want to focus too much on this sort of stuff in Head Shepherd, but it is good to understand, particularly when we're out there producing genetics for a future period of time, and we really need to make sure that the markets align with what we're thinking the future will be. So it was great to hear from Angus and hear his perspective, and I'm sure people will enjoy particularly hearing about what 2026 looks like for us in the red meat sector. But we'll get on with the show and hear from Angus. Welcome back to Head Shepherd. This week we're thrilled to have Angus Gidley-Baird from Rabobank with us. Welcome, Angus.
G'day, Mark. Good to be here.
Excellent. Angus, you're the Senior Analyst Animal Proteins there, and so we're expecting to hear all things about what's happening in the world. And I obviously everyone wants you to predict the future, and I'm no different. So we'll have that chat for our listeners. But before we get into the detail, it'd be just good to hear your backstory, the sort of career path to end up at Rabo in your current team.
Yeah. So I'm in. My family's not off the land per se. We've always had a strong connection with it. That was, I think, where Mum and Dad sent us when the school holidays came around and they wanted to get rid of us. So there was a close family friend that we spent a lot of time with. We ended up managing and running it for a number of years afterwards, mainly on the cattle side of things, but they ran some sheep as well. So that sort of gave me a little bit of a taste for ag, and I was keen to. Yeah, I really enjoyed it and wanted to keep doing it. I did ag at school, and then when I got to uni time or making a decision on uni, I didn't really know what to do. So chose ag economics, and sort of then fell into a role with New South Wales Farmers Association, which is an advocacy group, a bit like national farmers, state farming organisations, federated farmers in New Zealand, those sorts of things. So did that for about 10 years. The obligatory sort of travel around Australia, travel over in Europe, and worked over in Europe in the UK for about 18 months, 12 months with the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which is their equivalent of Department of Ag, and came back here and a bit more time with New South Wales Farmers, and then ended up at Rabo. So I really enjoy it. I think it's great. Being able to look at what's going on in the markets, have that contact and be in touch with everyone in agriculture, but at the same time, the convenience and the family that's based here in Sydney means that access to things that you probably don't get anywhere else. But I really enjoy it. I think it's great. And the freedom that we've got within Rabo Research to sort of within our tram lines of the sectors that we cover, to be able to look at what's going on in that market, understand how it's having an impact, try and distill through all the noise and come up with insights as to, what it might mean for a producer or a processor. And, again, we're across the whole supply chain from, the family farm to the corporate farm to the agents, the processors, the retailers, the traders, multinational food service organisations, those sorts of things. So you get a great perspective on what's going on across the whole supply chain.
Yeah, it's awesome, and obviously Rabo are 100% embedded in agriculture, so it's it'd be great to be working in a bank that's committed to ag in such a way.
Yeah, and that's probably, that's the real reason why Rabo Research exists within Rabobank. It's outside of the Netherlands, which is its base. We're completely food and ag focused. So, with that exposure to that one sector, we don't have the ability to jump from sector to sector depending on, profitability or economic situations or anything like that. So we're committed to food and ag, and as a result, they set up this Rabo Research team as partly as a way of giving them the assurance that the cycles and the fluctuations we see in commodity markets on a regular basis, to give them the confidence that there's long-term future and prospects in those sectors, and gives us an ability to invest or to commit to partnerships within the food and ag sector over a long-term horizon.
Excellent. So our listeners are mostly, not all, we've got 15% in Europe, but the rest, Europe and the US and the Americas, but the rest in Australia and New Zealand. They're obviously the two biggest exporters of lamb and mutton, and love to compete on all things, including who invented pavlova. They've both had some climatic struggles over the last little while, and that's going to impact on total turnoff. If it hasn't already, it will later in the year, as this lamb crop should be reduced, I guess. What are you seeing in these markets at the moment?
Yeah, and particularly from an Australian point of view, obviously the dry conditions that a lot of Australia saw through 2018-19, the rebuild that subsequently happened, favourable seasonal conditions for large parts of southern Australia, which is the main sheep producing areas, have allowed a recovery in the flock, and although it's a little bit hard to get a conclusive number on how many sheep are out there, but I'd imagine we've got some pretty healthy sheep numbers out there at the moment, and we've seen that. We're starting, in the last 18 months, the volumes of lambs and sheep coming to market, the slaughter numbers that we're seeing at the moment, lamb slaughter is at record levels, sheep slaughters at historically high volumes. And although we have seen some drier conditions, yes, particularly southern parts of Australia, Victoria, Western Victoria, southeast South Australia, Western Australia, southwest Western Australia, which do tend to be the higher, more densely populated sheep populations. So we have seen some people, obviously, with feed conditions, possibly either feeding or maybe not being able to finish lambs, but I don't think at the moment we're necessarily in a situation where we're seeing huge liquidation of flocks and people selling right down on flocks. A lot of those areas I've just mentioned have also received some rain in the last couple of weeks as well, through July, which has given them some hope. It's winter, not much really grows in winter anyway, but it's the forecast as well from a bureau point of view is that it's looking towards neutral, potentially heading towards a La Nina again. So people, I think, are still reasonably positive about it from a seasonal point of view. So large volumes of lambs in the market as a result of the increased sheep flock, and it's amazing what we're able to sell them to at the moment. New Zealand, on the other hand, I was just catching up with Jen, my colleague over in New Zealand, earlier this morning to get a bit of an update on where things are. But she noted that there was possibly a bit of a sting in the tail from the El Nino in late autumn, but in most areas now looking pretty good. And likewise, lamb slaughter over there has ticked past the 15 million head mark, as I understand, as of mid-June. And they're looking for a 17 million for the 23-24 season, which, as I understand at the moment, according to June numbers, is up about 8% at the moment. So, some large volumes, definitely large volumes coming out of Australia, and some slightly higher volumes out of New Zealand at the moment too. So a lot of lamb around. Does create a bit of a challenge trying to sell it into a global and domestic market though.
Yeah, I guess we'd be expecting the impacts of the seasonal conditions to impact, later supply with scanning's back a bit, and I'm imagining condition score is going to be low and some ewes, so our lamb survival is going to be back. So it'll be interesting how that plays out by the end of the year. I guess already we'd be expecting the first suckers to be not too far away from the market in places like Wagga. I suppose that area is better than the south, so we might be later in the year when we get less supply than what we might expect.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one to try and gauge. To me, that's sort of the $60 million question, because it's not only from a seasonal point of view in terms of whether or not we're going to see those new season lambs come onto the market in the normal time frame at the normal weights, or whether they are a bit later and people struggling to finish or get them to weight because of drier conditions and reduced feed availability. Or the other one is just sort of understanding as well what the impact of, from an Australian point of view, what the impact of this elevated sheep slaughter over the last 12 to 18 months is going to do as well. Is that it's always very difficult. You get total slaughter numbers for sheep, but you don't actually know whether they're male, female, what breed. So it's a bit of a guess as to whether or not, the large numbers of adult sheep that are being slaughtered at the moment are going to have a material impact on, how many ewes were on the ground, and therefore what our potential lamb numbers might be. So add that on top of the seasonal situation in terms of, lambing rates and conception rates and things like that. It'll be interesting to see. So, the next couple of months will be a good gauge anyway. It'll give us a fair indication. I mean, it's stating the obvious, but it's a fair indication as to whether or not there's going to be a large adjustment in Australian lamb production in this coming 12 months, or whether it's going to be a more, considered sort of smaller adjustment.
Yeah. I guess we're talking to farmers both sides of the ditch pretty much daily. We've got half our clients both sides of the ditch, which is interesting. And the differences in market prices always intrigue me. And it's always, I guess, at a macro level, they sort of follow the same trends, but often they're well out of sync. And it always intrigues me. And I thought you might know the answer as to why New Zealand and Australia are both major exporters, but sort of end up in different markets or different market situations.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. And just looking at the New Zealand prices, the Agri HQ South Island lamb price, that seems to be tracking just over $6.50 at the moment. It has edged up through the last couple of months, but still sitting well below sort of the 10-year minimums. Australian prices, on the other hand, our trade lamb prices are now up over $8. They've been going up quite strongly for the last couple of months and now above our 5-year average. So New Zealand prices are still well below the 5-year average at the moment. So, there is a very big difference. It's hard to say exactly what causes the price differential. Last year or 2022, lamb prices in New Zealand sort of probably held up a little bit better than Australian prices did, but at the same time, they're different markets too. We've got to remember, Australia exports, about 65% of our lamb production. New Zealand is up around 85, I think, as I understand. So we've got a much bigger domestic market that can absorb things. And I think at the moment, we're looking at quarterly data, so we're a bit behind, but our retail prices for lamb, based on our CPI information that comes out for quarter one, were 16% below what they were the same time quarter one last year. So we've seen quite a big reduction in retail prices. Now, you can't get a complete answer on how much is being consumed domestically, but a very sort of rudimentary back of the envelope calculation on volume produced, volume exported, and the difference being how much is consumed. If you run those numbers, it looks like there's potentially been a 10+% increase in domestic consumption in Australia. So the reduction in retail prices might have actually encouraged some domestic consumption here. That might be helping to absorb some of these numbers, because when you start talking price, you've got to look at the competition landscape. So if the Australian domestic consumer is buying more, then it means that those exporters or the processors and exporters aren't having to push as much into an export market. And the US looks like, we're seeing good volumes go to the US at the moment from an Australian point. And that's one other point of difference, is that Australia effectively has, you could call it 4 large markets. We've got a domestic market that takes about 30-35%. We've got the Middle East, China, and the US last year all took about 13% of our overall production. So we've probably got a few more markets, large markets, to take that product, as opposed to New Zealand, which is very export focused and very China and Europe focused in that mix as well. Australian lamb, I think we only send about 2 or 3% of our total lamb exports go to Europe, so it's a much smaller market. And China is particularly soft at the moment. We're hearing from our economist earlier today about some of the figures that are coming out of China at the moment, and that economy is quite weak. It's generally not a high price paying customer anyway, but it does take large amounts of volume. But the challenge with the large exposure New Zealand has to that market, I think, is probably just having a bigger impact on your markets, whereas Australia is able to. We seem to have reinvigorated the Australian domestic consumer, and they might be buying a bit more, and the US market is buying quite a lot more at the moment as well, and prices to the US are holding up and slightly increasing. So that's probably just creating that slight difference in the two markets.
Sam Kerkovich will claim 85% of
that. No doubt.
It's a good chance Sam's not listening, so I'm pretty safe. We'll just cover off those markets while we're on it. Obviously the quota changes to the UK. Is that, and yeah, you've mentioned Chinese growth is still in decline. So is that UK quota change going to have any impact, really, or is it not going to be as scary as what?
Yeah, from an Australian point of view, it will. It's a positive thing, definitely getting greater quota.
Depends if you're a Kiwi or an Australian, I think. But,
yeah, well, I mean, New Zealand dominates that market, so we're probably feeling we've been hard done by for a number of years now, and we're finally clawing something back. But I mean, New Zealand, and this is another interesting thing too. I noted, what you flagged from a question point of view is the type of lamb that's being grown and the weights that are being grown, and again, those differences in export markets might be having an influence on it, and obviously that UK European dominance for New Zealand, probably what we call a more traditional lamb consumer, like most of the Europeans, a leg of lamb, those types of things, roast lamb, calls for generally a sort of certain size. That dominance of the European market is probably meaning that New Zealand lamb carcass weights haven't increased as much as, say, Australians ones, where we're sending a lot more to that US market. But back to the UK market, I mean, yes, increased access is great. It's always good. The challenge, I think, from an Australian point of view in that UK and European market, although we don't have a free trade agreement with the European Union, and that's probably going to be a number of years before that actually happens now. The supply channels into that market are already very well established, and the consumers are already very well established. So unlike a China market where you've got just a general increase in consumption absorbing more product, the market in Europe is very mature. So you're not necessarily seeing any growth in overall volumes, although I understand UK production this year is down a bit and their imports are up, so they've got to fill some of that gap. But generally, we're talking about a consumer that's fairly well entrenched in terms of what their consumption habits are. So the only way Australian volume can get into that market is effectively displacing someone else. It's not a overall growth, so there's an added competitiveness in that market for us to gain share. The UK or Europeans also very parochial. They like their locally sourced product as well. And as I said, the Australian product with our US market, volumes going to that US market, the availability of product here in Australia that might meet the specs that need to go into UK market might not be as big as what we actually think. But you definitely, in speaking to processors and exporters here, they see it as an opportunity to increase, and they are increasing sales into that market. Whether we ever get to the same sort of volumes that New Zealand does in that market, it'll be a long way off, I would suggest.
Yeah, I imagine there's a fair bit of protection going on from the marketing angle. I guess both sides of the ditch, and as you sort of mentioned, that we are seeing a drift to heavier carcasses. Like, I guess what would have been here in New Zealand, 14, 15 kilo lamb is now probably more 18, 19, 20. In Australia, it's kind of gone from 18 to 20 to 22 to 24. And now, I don't know, I think the grids are sort of anything under 25 is probably getting less. Anyway, we're definitely seeing price premiums heading for bigger carcasses. That's obviously more efficient from a processing point of view, I'm assuming. Is that trend continuing, and is the market is the market happy with that outcome, or is that the processors sort of just trying to be more efficient?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. One I might challenge um, our retailers with when I get a chance to have a chat with them, because you can understand from a processor point of view, heavier lamb going through, it's one body on a chain, and if you're getting more off it, then
Yeah.
it's giving you a better yield and better utilisation of your labour and better returns and all that. So you can understand that. Our average slaughter weight for Q1 this year was up above 24 kilos. So 5 years ago it was 23, and 10 years ago it was 21. So it's an ever increasing plane at the moment of increased weights. And as you said, the pricing grids are not penalising people for those sorts of weights. I remember speaking to an Australian producer probably 5+ years ago, and I think anything over 24 kilos got a discount. Now I think you can get to 26 or 28 kilos before you start getting a discount. So the incentive's there from a pricing point of view, and if you can put the weight on. And maybe there's a little bit of that too with, we're doing a lot more, Australia's doing a lot more sort of finishing, and you see, feedlots and grain bins and paddocks and things like that. There's a lot more of that coming into play, which if you're not getting penalised from the extra weight, the opportunity there to put the weight on does probably start to add up. So, yeah, but I don't know. I don't know whether this desire to chase weight is necessarily the best thing for the market. I had the fortune of being over in the US back in 2019 before everything went upside down. And I went to a couple of feed yards in the US there, which, they're putting sheep on feed, which I thought was interesting. They were effectively trying to replicate the beef industry for sheep. They were taking sheep out of the mountain country. The lambs were being taken off their mothers as they headed into winter. They stuck them in a feed yard over winter, and then they tried to hold those lambs until they got to Easter, which is their peak lamb consumption period. And it wasn't a feedlot like a beef feedlot. This is how much weight gain they were looking for. It was almost like a holding pen to try and keep them at weights. And they were big. Those sheep over there I think some of them were nudging 40 kilos from a carcass weight point of view.
Yeah.
They're big. Yeah. So I can understand, Australia sending more product to the US, and the US system over there has got a bigger animal and a bigger product. They're not as accustomed as we are to lamb, how we eat it. I was told a while ago that, the ideal weight for a lamb leg is 2 kilos when it sits on the retail shelf. And my rough calculations were, well, that's about a 22, 24 kilo carcass. So I don't know whether or not, that's why I said it's a question for the retailer is, are we going to ask our consumer to eat a bigger product? Are we looking for a bigger eye muscle? Are we looking for a bigger lamb leg? Or are we just going to start trimming this stuff off? And are we going to turn it into, like the US does, hamburger trade, which you sort of then ask yourself the question, well, why are we chasing extra weight if we're not getting the same dollars for it at the end of the day? Like if they're taking a lamb leg that suddenly becomes 2.5+ kilos, and they're trimming it off to get it down to a smaller weight, that trim's got to go into a lower price product. You sort of wonder, well, should we be going in that direction? I don't know. But at the moment, the price incentive is to keep producing more.
Yeah, I guess that presents, on-farm challenges with if there's a discount to produce lighter carcasses, and then so therefore lambs hanging around on farm longer, which are eating tucker that should be going down the ewe's throat for the next drop, and there's all sorts of flow-on benefits of heading for that bigger carcass. When you end up with bigger ewes to produce those bigger carcasses, and anyway, it's I think it's an interesting industry challenge anyway, and I guess we've got to be careful that tail's not wagging the dog a bit, but.
Yeah, and I was speaking to Jen, my colleague in New Zealand. She was saying that it probably provided a bit of breathing space this year with lower lamb prices in New Zealand, and without seasonal pressure of no feed available, your ability to grow a heavier article and at least recover a better overall dollars per head possibly worked in your favour as opposed to being discounted for adding some extra kilos. So it sort of can work both ways, but I think as you say, you just got to be conscious of what that actual consumer wants, because I think both from an Australian and New Zealand point of view, lamb is a very small part of the overall global protein, and it is being positioned as a bit of a premium protein. So you have to be acutely aware as to what that customer's actually looking for, and make sure you supply that rather than trying to push volume into a market. It's only going to degrade whatever premiums you've got. Yeah,
for sure. We might go there next. We always hear the quote, we don't need to feed the world, we just need to feed the world's affluent, or or things along those lines. And as an industry, we've invested pretty heavily in IMF, in beef and lamb, and it's frequently on the agenda when we're having discussions with people about their breeding objectives. I guess how do you see that premium end of the market playing out? Is that being driven? I mean, it's driven by a different set of levers a bit, and is that growing, stagnant? What's happening in premium?
Yeah, I think this is really exciting, this space, particularly from a lamb point of view. And I apologise to the New Zealand listeners if I don't know as much about the New Zealand industry, but the interesting thing for me is a lamb is a lamb, and that's effectively what you're selling from that's the quality descriptor.
Yeah.
It's either lamb or it's not.
Yeah.
Whereas you look at some of the beef grading schemes that are around the world, and there's obviously the manufacturing language around yearling and ages and number of teeth and all the rest of it. But they've also, as you noted, IMF and yield and all those sorts of things and different grading levels. The US has a grading scheme over there we can see that's actually driven improvements in quality because of the pricing structure they've got around it. I think it's really exciting from a lamb point of view because that age-old conversation around, well, once it gets two worn bottom permanent teeth, it's suddenly not as good as the bloke next door that doesn't have those two worn bottom teeth,
Yeah.
And if you can actually create an objective measure to say, well, this is that quality, and I mean, then we shouldn't shy away from there will be lambs that have been sold as lamb and possibly getting exactly the same price as the good quality one that might receive a discount because it's a bit more objective. But I think particularly for lamb, when you're selling a product to a consumer out there, not a customer, consumer, that's, not necessarily, it's not an Australian or a New Zealand consumer that's been eating lamb all their life, but they're trying something for the first time. If you don't hit that quality mark, they might not ever go back to it again. Yeah. So I think it's exciting to be able to, that the industry is sort of moving in that direction to create some of those objective measures that allow it to, create that quality scale so they can position the right product into that right market and ensure that, the Walmart or wherever it is in the US that's buying lamb, that they get that same quality every day of the year because they can track it and measure it as opposed to it's lamb. It meets the definition for lamb because there's a variety within what is lamb, isn't there?
Yeah. So. Massive, yeah. And I do stir the Kiwis up a bit about the fact that IMF here is about half of what it is in Australia in lamb. And
I think that's the other. I mean, again, too, we talk IMF and they talk yield, but again, it's understanding what the consumer wants too, and it might not be like Wagyu in the beef industry where everyone aims for a 6 or a 7 or an 8 or whatever it is marble score, but we just know what the actual IMF level is that produces the most desirable eating product. Because I was a bit blown away when someone told me, well, you can have two lambs on the plate and they're both called lamb and they're both sold as lamb, but one could be a brilliant eating experience and one's diabolical, but they're both paid the same and you pay the same for both. And the only thing that characterises it in a quality sense is that it's lamb as opposed to mutton. So
no, we're destined for a lot more sophistication hopefully around that. And it is interesting that IMF versus sort of sheer force. Like you can get a good eating experience from something like obviously the New Zealand product tends to be young or younger and smaller, and so wouldn't have as much IMF just by age, but is young and therefore more tender versus Australian product, which tends to be a little bit older and then for more IMF developed. And so anyway, there's lots of things to play out, but it will be intriguing as we get more and more technology hitting the hitting the processing works, but then into helping get good stuff to the consumers.
Exactly, yeah.
We might just finish out on sheep with, I guess, just a quick thoughts on what happens when 500,000 sheep don't leave WA on a ship each year if that ban goes through, which it has gone through. So, but as far as I can tell, that's about the same as we kill every week in Australia. Is that about right? Is that the sort of numbers? Is that going to have what's the impact on the east of? I know the west are going to have. There's no doubt that'll impact on the local market there, but generally for Australia, is there anything that's going to next 3 years going to have any impact there?
Yeah, it's there are so many variables that are at play here in terms of what the end result might be from an impact point of view. But yet you look at the basic numbers, and yet 2022 we sent just under 500,000. 2023 we sent almost 600,000, and as you say, at the moment we're doing about 450,000 head a week lamb kill. That is, so those total export numbers are all sheep, not just lambs, but all sheep.
Yeah.
Year to date, for the first 3 or 4 months of this year, we're actually up further on last year's numbers, but by the looks of things, the May numbers were a bit behind last year, so we're sort of back in line now. It's an interesting one. The other thing too is trying to understand the interstate trade, the volume coming out of WA into eastern states, and we've seen some huge numbers in the past. I think it was 2019 or 20 when we were rebuilding the eastern states. We saw over 1 million head of cattle. Million head of sheep come across as a result. The way I look at it is it's a market, and it plays its role at different points in time. If seasons are dry and people need to offload, it becomes a great avenue for people to do that. It's another buyer in the market. Without it there, you've effectively got a domestic processing buyer that's looking to sell a very small amount into a domestic market because it's effectively just WA. The rest of it's got to go into an export market. So the competition for the product is a lot lower. But again, it's hard to say. We've got this deadline now of it's May 2028. Do we see the Western Australian sheep flock increase in that time or decrease in that time? Do we see the seasons mean that we've got large numbers available in 27 that have to go somewhere and suddenly we lose a market? Do we have lower volumes in 27 and the volumes in live export have declined further? It's very difficult to see how it plays out. The numbers from a WA point of view, when we look at it in terms of what we see as being the processing capacity over there and the quarterly volumes of sheep and lambs that are being killed and those that are going live export and those that are being sold interstate, the system as it stands at the moment we think will be under pressure at certain points in times in the year. Does that mean we need more processing capacity to accommodate that, or does that mean that the producers need to adjust their systems and operations to be able to hold or get rid of lambs and sheep earlier or at different times to be able to try and smooth that out and create a balance? Because there are definitely a few peaks in the season that would put the processing current facilities under pressure. So there are a number of those questions. I look at it a little bit as an economist and hope that, with 4+ years or 4 years to transition, the decisions will be made over the next 4 years, and hopefully that reduces the suddenness of any impact. I look at the WA industry and think there's still some great opportunities in WA, and particularly when we're having a conversation about heavy lamb weights and things like that. They've got a massive grains industry over there. Whether or not it gets a bit of a readjustment, and you see lambs that are growing heavier, finished on grain, sent to an export market and really develop that market, because the East Coast lambs will supply the Australian domestic market. You need to build an export market, or if there are things like opportunities into India, etc., sending product into those markets as well. So it's hard to say. I think, needless to say, there's obviously a fair amount of tension in the market at the moment and concern, and obviously it will mean that there are some people that have to make some pretty tough decisions or big decisions over the coming years. But I think there's still an opportunity and a future in the WA sheep market.
Yeah, no, really interesting. Thank you. Before we close out with our final question, we should talk about beef cattle. I had Simon Quilty on recently, so he covered a fair bit of that. But other than finding 4 million cattle or whatever we found recently in the stats, what's happening in beef?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like the Grinch after Simon, I would imagine. I'm not as bullish as he is on the cattle markets. But,
I tried to remind him of history a bit, but
but I mean, then again, I'm not doing too well on the sheep market at the moment either. I look, there's there's definite upside for the cattle market, both Australia and New Zealand. We're seeing that at the moment. Some good prices in New Zealand. Prices are lifting. Well, prices have been pretty steady in Australia, but we've got large volumes of cattle in the market over here. But that US market, the shortage in the US, is definitely going to mean for at least the next 12, 18, possibly 2 years worth, there's going to be a lack of supply in that lack of production in the US market, and that's going to require imports. It's going to mean less exports into key markets that Australia supplies of Japan, South Korea, and China. And they will go through a rebuild phase, although we don't believe it's happened yet. It'll be interesting to see how many heifers are placed on feed in this second half of the year, because that'll give us an indication as to whether or not they want to hold on to their breeding stock or whether they're going to send them to market. And we're probably looking at the beginning of next year as an indication on seasonal conditions as to whether people start to hold numbers. Our US colleague, Lance Zimmerman over there, is thinking with a number of other pressures in the system, it's possibly going to be a much slower recovery. The costs over there are a lot higher than what they were last time. And there are a number of reasons. The average US beef producers, I think something like 90-odd% of the cattle, I think, or 90-odd% beef producers sit under 200 head or something like that.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of small operators.
Yeah.
So there are a number of those things that lead him to believe that the recovery process is going to be long. It's going to take a couple of years. So that's good news from an Australian-New Zealand point of view in terms of providing positive price support in that global market. One thing we do have to just keep an eye on is those Asian markets, particularly from an Australian point of view, though. If you don't have any competition in the US willing to pay what it is, if it's not being bid up any higher than it has to, we may not see the prices jump to the same level. So that's probably my key at the moment, is just watching those the Japan, South Korea, and China's of the world, because you can see that US domestic lean trim price is historically very high. The imported Australian New Zealand product is not near it at the moment, and it might be just because some of those other markets aren't competing as much for it, and the US buyer can get it at a lower price point. So yeah, but it's definitely price upside for the next couple of years, which is favourable from an Australian point of view, given that we've got quite a strong, healthy herd at the moment, and seasonally things are looking all right. So might be, some good times ahead, although I'm not predicting the same records that Simon is.
Well, luckily history will tell us, or time will tell.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The last question is one that we ask everyone, which can get interesting answers, but what's the last thing you changed your mind about?
Well, I presume this is in relation to the livestock markets. There are a lot of things I change my mind about on a daily basis.
I was going to say a non-work related thing that you change your mind about, but either way, yeah.
Well, work related at the moment, I'm just watching land prices where they are in Australia. Not so good in New Zealand, but land prices in Australia just keep heading up at the moment. And the modelling that we've done here, and if you read our projections at the beginning of the year, we were suggesting a $6 price tag on lambs, and it's now above $8. So I'm just really trying to scratch my head to figure out where this is coming from. It's not a supply shortage. We're at record volumes, so it's got to be a demand thing, but I can't see anything. And admittedly, I don't get price data out of the Middle East or price data out of China that I rely on. But the US prices are about the same, maybe a little bit higher, but I don't know. Maybe that's just enough. Maybe it's domestic market. Maybe the Australian consumer is eating a lot more. I'm not sure. So it does make me a little bit concerned that it's nudged well above where I thought they should be, and whether or not it's going to correct itself. But again, that's probably a little bit of that question on how many lambs are coming in, how many lambs are left in the system from last year, and how many are going to come in on this season. And are the buyers out there seeing something I can't see in terms of availability and trying to get some numbers through now, knowing that it's going to be short? I don't know. Yeah, so that's probably one thing I might be changing my mind about.
Yeah. Well, it'd be good if you're going to be wrong that way. Yeah. $2 a kilo more is always good. Yeah.
That's right. It's always better to be under than over.
Yeah. I guess that. Yeah, that's again that Australia New Zealand thing does always intrigue me. I mean, I think New Zealand did definitely carry that little weakening price. Well, they kept the price up for longer, and we had two of our big co-ops lost about $100 million between them. So you've got to think that bled a lot of was partly how that money stayed up. So that's obviously can't be done again. So that, I guess that's probably, all those things are at play. But that it's interesting how, that domestic market is something we've got to keep remembering. That's Aussies eating a lot of, having 25 million people eating a bit is useful for our meat markets.
That's right. We're having some tonight, so lamb on the menu tonight.
I've been helping Simon eating a bit of beef lately. Haven't a bit of big beef.
Well, I must admit, I get this because my brother grows them rather than going to the shop to pay for them.
Yeah, that's the best kind. Excellent, Angus. Looking forward to seeing you at Lamex, and good to catch up there. Your Rabobank podcast, where do people find that to hear from your team regularly?
Yeah, so we do a regular podcast. I'm probably not as regular as you on it, but the whole team do it. So it's a cross commodity thing from you'll hear dairy stuff and consumer food stuff and grains and oilseeds, beef, sheep meat, all the rest of it. If you just search on your podcast channel for Rabo Research Australia, New Zealand, it should come up there. And there's usually a new podcast every week, if not a couple of weeks.
Perfect. No, very fantastic. And thanks very much for your time, mate, and look forward to catching up in Adelaide.
Yeah, no, it'll be good. Thanks, Mark.
Cheers. Thanks again to Heineken, who are proud world leaders in the manufacturing and supply of professional sheep shearing and clipping equipment. Thank you to MNSD Animal Health and Norflex Livestock Intelligence. They offer an extensive livestock product portfolio focused on animal health management, all backed up by exceptional service. We thank both of these companies for their ongoing support of the Head Shepherd podcast.